Hosea chapter 4. I want you to take a moment and think for a second. Do you remember the old, I'm talking about the old, like Perry Mason. Remember Perry Mason? Familiar with him? The courtroom dramas that would be played on our TVs, and how that Perry Mason, it was always interesting how he would go and investigate and would do all these things and bring it all before the judge. And at the last minute, the last little bit of information would come in, and he would present that before the judge, the jury, and normally point the finger of accusation at somebody else. Remember that? Remember how many times that seemed to be constant? Somebody else did it, not the defendant. The defendant's not guilty. His client is innocent, and I can prove it. Well, today in Hosea, I'm going to tell you we're not going to see any of that. Not going to see the first bit of that. Because that's not how things work with God. That's not how things work. There is no defense to these things. There is no defense in front of our righteous and just God. When He says you did, He knows that you did. When He says, Israel, you're guilty, they were guilty. It didn't make any difference if they thought they were guilty. It didn't make any difference if everybody else around thought they were innocent or guilty. God says that they were. And so in Hosea chapter 4, we change scenes. We've been talking about Hosea and his family, the very difficult situation that Hosea was in, and the heartbreak that was there. We see that they're now been reconciled. Well, I say they've been reconciled. He's taken her back. Wouldn't it be nice to know what happened in Hosea's family? Wouldn't it be nice to have some, did Gomer stay? Did they live happily ever after? The Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know. All we know is what we finished off with in chapter 3 last week, that Gomer's back home and to abide. But now God shifts gears. Now we go from the scene of a home to the scene of a courtroom. We go with a setting where God says, I have something against you. He's talking to the nation of Israel. So let's look at Hosea chapter 4, verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel, for the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. So as we begin in Hosea chapter 1, we see the word controversy. This word actually is the idea of an indictment. It's a legal term. You have done something wrong, and I'm going to bring a charge against you. Now, Israel, as we know, is kind of in bad shape. That's what we've been talking about already in the first 3 chapters of the book of Hosea. And so now we're going to see how God shifts gears. God is trying to do everything that He can to show the nation of Israel their problem. He wants them to see how they've abandoned God, how they've walked away from everything God has given them. And so we see this courtroom, and we see these accusations that God has brought against the nation of Israel. Now, this may sound strange. How does this apply to us? We'll get there. We'll get to what God has to say to us as well. But look in verse 2, you'll see that he continues on the thought as he ends off in verse 1, by swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, thou break out and blood touches blood. Now, when you hear that, what are those first things it talks about, swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery? Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like something you might have heard before? What may they have been violating? Those are the 10 Commandments. Those are the 10 Commandments that they are, he says, you are violating the moral code that we agreed upon. If you remember back, we talked about the code that they had, the covenant that they had broken. Not the Abrahamic covenant, But the covenant on Mount Sinai, when Moses stood there and delivered to them the 10 Commandments, and God said, if you'll do these things, I'll be your God and you'll be my people and I'll protect you and I'll do all these things. And the nation of Israel said, yes, yes, we will do that. Yes, we will follow you. You will be our God and we will be your people. And now God is saying, you violated that. You have violated those, not even all the code. I'm talking about just the first 10. You violated these things. These are what you're doing. And the little phrase where it says blood touches blood, the idea of that is that there is so much violence in the land that there is bloodshed after bloodshed after bloodshed. And we know when you look at there, even in the, God may have been referring to what was going on in the streets. But when you look at the last few years of the nation of Israel before they were taken to captivity, there were several changes of leadership. When you look over in the book of, I believe it's 2 Kings, you look over in there, there's several changes of leadership of the king, and most of them were through assassination. Israel had become a dangerous place. Israel had become a sinful place. And God says, I have an indictment against you. Now, you were doing exactly what I told you not to do. You have violated the moral fiber that I wanted to establish in a society that is a God-fearing society. And we see that God has had enough. God has had enough of their violation. He's still trying to warn them. He's still trying to say, listen, if you'll come back to me, all of this is really meant to get them to return, to get them to come back, to listen to God, to go back under his moral fiber. But now these things God's listed in this indictment, they're all things we really want. We want to have in our society, right? We want people to be honest and to be faithful and loyal. We don't want people to kill each other. We want God's morality in our country, in our nation. But we see we're not careful, we wind up in the same thing. And people say, well, this is specific to Israel. It is, but if you look over into Psalms 33 and 12, you'll find a statement that we're familiar with. It says, blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord. And it continues and says, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. Now, when the psalmist wrote this, he was obviously speaking about Israel. But that's not the only thing God was speaking about. He didn't say, blessed is Israel, whose nation is the Lord. He said, blessed is the nation. That's kind of an open-ended promise, isn't it? Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Now, I'm not going to get off on a lot of history today, but I'm just going to tell you, you can go back and do a little research. This nation was founded on Christian principles and doctrines. Contrary to what the society wants to tell you today in our revisionist history that you can see going on, unfolding in front of your eyes every day, just watch the news. They want you to think that the founding fathers of our nation were agnostic. They were not Christian. They were agnostic. They believed in everything was a God. They believed that there was everything was a God, or they were atheists and they didn't believe in a God at all. Well, go back and read what they wrote. They didn't write like that. They didn't pass legislation like that. They were Christian. Amen. And now we see today a hurry to get away from godly principles. We see a hurry. They want to quickly move away. And God says that's a bad thing. That's a bad deal. Now, if you look in verse 3, there's a result of leaving God. There's a result of leaving God's moral standards, of violating his moral requirements. And they are that the land shall mourn, and everyone that dwelleth therein shall languish. It even continues on and talks about the birds of the air and the beasts of the field and even the fish. The land is going to languish. The people languish and the land is going to mourn. Now, Israel is tied very closely to a piece of land over there in the Near East. A little piece of land right on the Mediterranean coast that God deeded to them years, centuries, millennia ago. And God has always tied their blessings to that piece of property. God's always tied their blessings. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to provide for you. There's going to be water. There's going to be food. I'm going to bless you. And God's blessings seem to be tied to a land, to a piece of property. Often, this nation has been blessed because our God has been Jehovah. Our God it's been something that was important to us. And it is important that we understand that there is a price to pay when you violate that moral code. And I don't need to tell you, just look at the news. Just look at the news today and see if we're not seeing that. See if we're not having that problem. But I want us to go on and look at the next charge. In verse 6, you've rejected knowledge. You have rejected knowledge. Verse 6 says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee. Thou shalt be as no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children. That's a very ominous way to end that little verse, isn't it? I will forget thy children. Now, I want us to understand that the idea here is not that there was not knowledge available. The idea here is not that there was not understanding available to the people. It was there. They had the scriptures, but they had chosen to abandon God. They had chosen to reject the knowledge that God had given them. And because of this, they're going to suffer. Now, I want you to see that knowledge is critical to build anything. It is critical, knowledge and truth. It's one thing to have a bunch of information in your head. It's another thing to have true information in your head. You cannot build anything, you cannot maintain anything without the truth. If you're going to build a house, do you need to know some truth? Well, I got to know what the plan is, right? And then I need to kind of know what level is. And then I kind of need to know what plumb is, right? I'm no builder, but that sounds like pretty good information I'd want to know right off the bat. The same thing with a nation. You cannot build a nation, you cannot maintain a nation on a lie. You have to maintain everything with truth. And God says, I've given you truth, I've given you knowledge, but you chose to reject it. Now we see that more and more every day, don't we? Every day, we Christians are ridiculed and mocked more and more. Every day, people look at us and you're the problem, and you just don't have to look around very far, and you'll see people pointing the fingers and going, the problem with this is the Christians. The problem with this is those folks that believe this fairy tale. Don't they believe in science? Of course, my answer to that, and I want to get off just a second, my answer to that is simply, you believe that everything came from nothing. And you say, I believe in a fairy tale? Everything just went, there it was, and it took billions of years to create. That snowman sitting out front of my house in the winter, no one made that snowman. The snow just blew together. Snowman, red scarf and all. And that is so much more simple than the simplest cell, the simplest life. But that just happened. I believe, as I look through nature, I see a designer. I see somebody that had a plan. And planning takes intelligence. And the ability to accomplish that plan takes power. And that's God. I don't believe a fairy tale. You do. if you think all this just, poof, started one day developing. That is a rejection of knowledge. You are choosing to believe a lie over the truth. God gave us the truth. And see, the problem is that we have not stood on the truth. Now, I have to admit, I'm guilty of this. I have stood by and not said things. I have stood by and for the sake of, well, I don't want to argue, we have stayed silent. Matter of fact, they call us the silent majority. You ever heard that statement? Why are we silent? Why do we keep our mouths shut? Why do we stand still and not take action? Why do we allow somebody else who is rejecting knowledge and rejecting truth to have their way? Why do we do that? We have stood still and our nation has gone down and down and down farther every day to a spiral that has gotten carried away. And we see the results. We see that since we have stood still, we can see the results of what's happening. Now I want you to notice that I said the ominous ending, because I will forget your children. Now, this isn't a response to the leadership. He is directing his criticism pretty closely to the priests. Now, I want you to understand, these are not the Levitical priests that Moses set up. These are the priests that were set up when Israel and Judah split and they established the new worship, and they set up two golden images, one in Bethel and one in Gilgad. And they set up two images, and these were the priests that were established there. So they are lying, they're worshiping false idols, and they're leading the people astray. But the people are following. And what was supposed to be their leadership, instead of leading them to truth, led them into what they wanted. They led them into lust so they could have power, so they could have money, they could have possessions, because when you would bring something to the idols and you set it in front of that golden calf, what do you think happened to it? The priest took it. When you brought money to the temple, that golden calf didn't take that somewhere. The priest took the money. When you brought an offering, the priest took it. They were getting rich on a false idol. Boy, does that sound familiar today? The false idol of humanism. Oh, you want to go do what you want to do? That'll be just fine. Just give me a campaign contribution. Well, Scott, that sounds like politics. That sounds like the truth. And we are worshiping on the false idol of pleasure and personal satisfaction. And that's what they were doing. These idols that they were worshiping were idols of debauchery. They were idols that were, go get drunk. Go commit adultery with the temple prostitutes. We'll get to that in just a second. Go do what you want to do. That's fine. Just keep bringing the money into the storehouse. Make the priests wealthy. And that's what we find is happening here. And God says, I'm going to forget your children. I'm going to forget your children. Now, what does that really entail? Well, first of all, it says God's not going to bless them. God's not going to extend blessing. That's the pretty simple observation, that there's going to be a problem. Your kids are not going to be blessed. The other thing is that the children wind up being just a little worse off than their parents. Let me say it this way. What parents tolerate, their children will permit, and their grandchildren will embrace. That is what is happening. And we are not only losing a country, we are losing an entire generation of children. We have gone to a downward spiral, and what was, well, I guess they can do what they want to do. That as long as they leave me alone, it'll be okay. We tolerated. Our kids have said, well, it's no big deal. I mean, it's an alternative lifestyle, right? Everybody to each his own. Permitted. And now we got a generation that's embracing sin. It's okay. No problem. And you just look around. Do I really need to elaborate farther on where that's gone? We're losing an entire generation of our children because we did not stand for the truth. We tolerated it. We tolerated sin, and it's costing us. Now, I want you to understand, when Hosea is preaching, he's prophesying. He's prophesying that you're going to be judged. We know that judgment is captivity in Assyria. Lots of people were going to die. But it wasn't going to be these people. It wasn't going to be these people he's preaching to when he first started preaching. They were going to die a natural cause in Israel. Guess who was going to go in captivity? Their children and their grandchildren. You see, we have to stand for what is right. Even when it's difficult. Even when everybody else says, oh no, you are old-fashioned. You are narrow-minded. You are absolutely right. And you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm a lot more narrow-minded than that. There is sin. And we need to call sin, sin. We need to call right, right, and we need to call wrong, wrong. And it's not my opinion. I don't get to say that what is right and wrong. The majority doesn't get to say what's right and wrong. God sets the standard. And if you don't line up with His standard, then you are wrong. Can I say that any different? Well, that doesn't seem very forgiving. Listen, there's a consequence to being wrong. There's a consequence and you don't want to pay it. But understand, it may not be you that really pays the price. It'll be your children and your grandchildren. We have to stand for what is right. We have to teach them that life isn't fair. You don't get your way. How many of you get your absolute way? Everything you want, you get. Not a soul. But yet we've got a generation of children growing up that think they get their way. Because we didn't teach them that life's not fair. Life is hard. Life is difficult. And it's even harder without the blessings of God. It's even more difficult without the truth. And that's why we run into these problems. We can't blame our children. And I'm going to tell you, we don't need to blame TV. It's not the TV's responsibility to raise your kids. Even though what usually raises most TV, I'm not pointing anybody out. I don't know anything, but I want to ask you a question. I've seen it a million times. What usually raises most children today? Am I right? They spend more time, and you're giving your influence to somebody else, and you don't even know their name. You're giving the influence of raising your children to somebody else, and you don't even know their name. We have to take back our children. I don't think it's too late. But I'm going to tell you, they're not going to like it. Just as Israel didn't like it. Just as they were, no, you don't understand. You are way too harsh. I'm too busy to spend that much time with my kids. Let me tell you, you're way too busy. You don't need that much money. You don't need that many things. You don't need that many hobbies. You spend time with your children. And you raise your children. And you raise your children in the nurture and the admiration of the Lord. Because nobody else is. The news media, social media, the schools are not teaching your children morality. They're teaching the exact opposite. They're teaching your children that you're just an animal. How can we expect teenagers to be pure? How can we expect people to get married and still be chaste? How can we expect that? I mean, you're asking a lot. No. You want God's blessing? Then do it God's way. Receive His blessing by following His guidelines. That's just not reasonable. How can you expect that? And that's the idea of our society. How could we ever expect people to live like that? It's called being saved. It's called knowing the Lord as your Savior. Doesn't mean you're perfect. Doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes. But it means you're going to do your best to follow His will. We see, if you look down, I want to catch a couple of more little points. The third charge is you're hypocrites. That's what God told Israel. Verse 14. Now I'm going to read this out of a different translation. The King James kind of gets a little bit confusing here. I'm going to read this out of a different translation. So that's why it'll sound different. I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes, and a people without understanding shall come to ruin. So there's some hypocrisy here. You got to remember, this is a male-dominated society. And they said, my women, my wife and my daughters, they need to be chaste and faithful. They need to be faithful to me. They need to do the right thing. But I'm going to go over to the temple where the prostitutes are and worship, which is exactly how they worship the God. I'm going to worship with the temple prostitutes. Now, does that sound a little bit hypocritical to you? Yeah, I think so. And God says, I'm not going to punish your daughters because you're being hypocritical. I'm not going to keep your wives chaste. I'm not going to convict them to be faithful to you because you're not being faithful to them or to me. And we see, and it doesn't take very long to see here how God's being very specific on how sin hurts, on how sin tears us down, on how immorality has a punishment of its own. It's not just that God's not going to bless you. It's that God's going to chastise you. It's that sin is going to cost you more than you anticipated. You know, it's been said that sin will keep you longer than you wanted to stay. That sin will take you places that you never intended on going. Sin is not just, most people don't just jump into sin. Ooh, I'm going to jump into this big sin. Ooh, I want to jump into, let's use adultery. I'm going to go out and commit adultery today. That doesn't normally enter someone's mind. It's one little compromise at a time. And sin leads you. I'm going to jump into drugs. I'm going to become a drug addict. No one makes that statement. It happens at one little compromise at a time. And we can go on and on. And those are just, I picked the big ones, but we can go on into anything, gossip or being untruthful. We don't become that overnight. We make one little step, and a little step, and a little step. The next thing you know, we've gone farther than we intended. And we're in a place we can't get out of. And that's what Israel did here. That's what happened to Israel. And we have to guard ourselves, or it'll happen to us. It'll happen. So it won't happen to me. Don't say that's foolishness. We're sinners just like anybody else, and we got to guard ourselves to stay pure and holy. so that we can be a morally upright people. What is wrong with our world? There's a lot of lost folks in it. There's a lot of people that need Jesus. And we need to tell them about Jesus. And I want to look at one more verse. I want us to look at verse 19. As Hosea is finishing up this chapter, God gives him one more thing to say. He says, the wind hath bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Now, when I read that, the very first thing that popped in my mind is the wind has bound her up. That sounds like a trap. That to me sounds like Israel got caught up in a trap. And it's going to make them ashamed. That's sin. That's sin. Sin looks inviting. Sin looks like, oftentimes people try to make sense. Well, that makes sense. For example, people are born that way. They're just born that way. It's no big deal. They're born a thief. They're just naturally born a liar. They're just naturally, and we can go with any sin. Does that make it okay? See, it sounds good until you go, well, that person's just naturally born violent. So when they punched me in the face, well, it was okay because they were born that way. No, we wouldn't accept that. We would not accept that because it's a trap that catches people. It's a trap that catches Christians, that catches children of God. Folks, we are surrounded by temptation. We are surrounded by sin. Every day it is more and more in our face. Is it not more and more in our face every day? It's in our face. It is pressed on us, and if you don't fall in for it, if you don't take it, then there's something wrong with you. Something wrong with you. Our society is spiraling into debauchery, and we must be careful ourselves not to get caught up in the spiral. We must take seriously our relationship with God. We cannot say God is our God, Jehovah is our God, and do what we want to do. We have to follow Him. And it is so easy to fall into the traps of Satan. Satan has had 8,000 to 10,000 years to practice his craft. How long have we had to practice? Well, I'm 40 years old. That's not even close. He's a lot better at what he does than I am at what I do. And what he offers sounds good to me, just as it sounds good to you. And we must guard our hearts. We must take serious our relationship with our God, because He has left us here for a purpose. And that purpose is to spread the good news of salvation to all people. But you can't spread that good news and not live a life that is, and we're not perfect, but that is holy and acceptable unto the Lord. We cannot spread that good news without living it ourselves. People need Jesus. They need Jesus more and more He is the answer to every problem. Is Jesus. And the only way they're going to hear about Him is if we tell them.